Hello Fanatics, I am Cindy and welcome to Diamond Painting Fanatics. I am back with my true crime episodes due to popular demand. I have been asked to do some more, so if you enjoy true crime and you enjoy diamond painting, please grab a project, come join me and we will discuss another true crime. Please consider hitting that subscribe button to join me on my true crime journey, and yeah, let's take a look at the project I'm going to be working on today and who we're going to be talking about. What bad person are we going to talk about this week? Stay tuned to find out. Today I want to talk about James Hanratty. He's also known as the A6 murderer, a British criminal who was one of the final 8 people in the UK to be executed before capital punishment was abolished. Let's find out what he did. James Hanratty was born on the 4th of October in 1936 in Farnborough, Kent, the oldest of 4 sons. Dad was also called James and his wife Mary Ann Hanratty. By 1937, the family had moved to Wembley in northwest London. James's early years were troubled. Long before his trial for the A6 murder, he had already been described as a retard, a psychopath, a pathological liar. Nice mix, isn't it? By the age of 11, he had been declared uneducationable at St James Catholic High School, although his parents steadfastly refused to accept he was in any way mentally deficient and successfully resisted attempts to have him placed in a special school. After leaving school in 1951, at the age of 15, James, still illiterate, joined the public cleansing department of Wembley Borough Council as a refuge sorter. In July of the following year, he fell from his bicycle, injuring his head and remaining unconscious for 10 hours. He was admitted to Wembley Hospital where he remained for 9 days. Shortly after his discharge, James left home for Brighton, where he obtained casual work with a road haulier. 8 weeks later, he was found semi-conscious in the street, having apparently collapsed from either hunger or exposure. Initially admitted to the Royal Sussex Hospital in Brighton, he was transferred to St Francis Hospital, Haywards Heath, where he underwent a craniotomy, following a diagnosis of a brain hemorrhage. The report made there acknowledged his unhappy home background. He claimed he was frightened of his mother and had no feelings towards his father, and his mental deficiency. No precise diagnosis was offered, and it has since been suggested that he suffered from either epilepsy or post-concussional syndrome, which would have had a marked effect on his personality. Can I just point something out here? We know, as fanatics of true crime, I am no professional by any means. I am just someone in a box sharing true crime episodes with you guys. But when you look back at proper serial killers, they've always had a head injury somewhere. But I just want to point out that when he had a craniotomy, he was 15. If you go back to the beginning of my episode, I clearly state that he was already described as a retard, a psychopath and a pathological liar before the age of 11. So he's already got the traits, and I don't even know what this guy has done yet. So yeah, you're not fooling me. Not saying that without that, do you know what I mean? But come on. James was sent to recuperate at an aunt's home in Bedford, a place he and his brother Michael had visited as children on holiday. James found a job there driving a mechanical shovel for the company of Green Brothers, which made breeze blocks, and he remained with the firm for 3 years. It was about 1954 that James became attracted to Soho, where he frequented various clubs and other haunts of the criminal underworld. On the 7th of September 1954, aged 17, James appeared before Harrow magistrates, where he was placed on probation for taking a motor vehicle without consent and for driving without a licence or insurance. Shortly afterwards, he began psychiatric treatment as an outpatient at the Portman Clinic. In October 1955, aged 18, James appeared at the County of Middlesex Sessions, where he was sentenced to 2 terms of 2 years imprisonment to run concurrently for housebreaking and stealing property. Dispatched to the boys' wing of Wormwood Scrubs, he slashed his wrists. Placed in the prison hospital, he was declared a, quote, potential psychopath. After his release, his father resigned his job as a dustman with Wembley Council to start a window cleaning business with his son in a futile attempt to keep him away from crime. On 3rd of July 1957, aged 20, only 5 months after his release from Wormwood Scrubs, James was sentenced at Brighton Magistrates Court to 6 months imprisonment. He served 4 of them for a variety of motoring offences, including theft of a motor vehicle and driving without a licence. He was sent to Walton Prison in Liverpool, where he again identified as a psychopath. In March 1958, aged 21, the County of London Sessions, James again was convicted of car theft. Doesn't seem to learn. He was driving while disqualified and sentenced to 3 years corrective training at Wandsworth Prison. Then to Maidstone Prison, where conditions were considered among the best in the UK. While at Maidstone, James came to the attention of a researcher, quote, participant observer, who lived and worked alongside the inmates. He was later to remark upon James's gross social and emotional immaturity. Escape attempt. James was transferred to Camp Hill Prison at the Isle of Wight, and then, following another bid for freedom, to Strangeways Prison in Manchester. Transferred briefly to Durham Prison, he was returned to Strangeways, where, having served his full term, he was released in March 1961, aged 24. Yeah, and that happened to be 5 months before the A6 murder, which we are now going to go into detail about. The facts as ascertained by the police. At about 6:45 a.m. on the 23rd of August 1961, the body of Michael John Gregston was discovered in a lay-by on the A6 road at Deadman's Hill, near the Bedfordshire village of Clophill, by John Kerr, an Oxford undergraduate conducting a traffic census. Lying next to Greg's... No, we're not going to do that. We're going to call them by their names. So his name was Michael. Lying next to Michael, semi-conscious, was Michael's mistress, Valerie Jean Story. Michael had been shot twice in the head with a .38 revolver at point-blank range. Valerie had been raped and then shot with the same weapon 4 times in the left shoulder and once in the neck, leaving her paralysed below the shoulders. John, the guy who stumbled across Michael and Valerie, alerted Sidney Burton, a farm labourer who flagged down 2 cars and asked the drivers to call an ambulance. The car Michael and Valerie had been using at the time of the attack, a grey 4-door 1956 Morris Minor, was found abandoned behind Redbridge Tube Station in Essex later that evening. The car had been jointly owned by Michael's mother and aunt and lent to the couple who, according to Valerie, were planning to attend a car rally. Michael was a scientist at the Road Research Laboratory in Slough. Valerie was an assistant at the same lab and had been having an affair with Michael, although this did not become public knowledge until Valerie wrote a series of articles for the Popular Today magazine in June 1962, 5 months after the trial. Michael had separated from his wife Janet, who lived with their 2 children at Abbots Langley. Valerie was an only child and she lived with her parents in Chippenham. Details of the murder from the testimony of Valerie, their mistress. Late in the evening of Tuesday the 22nd of August in 1961, Valerie was sitting alongside Michael in his car in a cornfield at Dorney Reach, Buckinghamshire. A man tapped on the driver's door window. When Michael wound it down, a large black revolver was thrust into his face, and a Cockney voice said, "This is a hold-up. I am a desperate man. I have been on the run for 4 months. If you do as I tell you, you'll be all right." The man got into the back of the car and told Michael to drive further into the field, then stop. The man then kept them there for 2 hours, chattering to them incessantly. Valerie recalled that he pronounced things as things and think as think. At 11:30 p.m, the man said he wanted food and told Michael to start driving. The gunman knew the Bear Hotel, Maidenhead. Michael was ordered to stop at a milk vending machine and sent into a shop to buy cigarettes, and then to stop at a petrol station for more fuel. Although Michael and Valerie offered to give him all their money and their car, the man appeared to have no plan and seemed to want them to stay with him. They drove around the suburbs of North London, apparently aimlessly. The journey continued along the A5 through St Albans, which the gunman mistakenly insisted was Watford, before joining the A6. At about 1:30 a.m. on Wednesday the 23rd of August, the car was on the A6, travelling south, when the man said he wanted a kip, go to sleep. Twice he told Michael to turn off the road and then changed his mind, and the car returned to the A6. At Deadman's Hill, the man ordered Michael to pull into a lay-by. Michael at first refused, but the man became aggressive and threatened them with the gun. The man then said he wanted to sleep, that he would have to tie them up. Valerie and Michael pleaded with him not to shoot them. The man tied Valerie's hands behind her back with Michael's tie, and then he saw a duffel bag containing some clean clothing. He told Michael to pass the bag, but as Michael moved, there were 2 shots. Michael had been hit twice in the head and died instantly. Valerie screamed, "You bastard! You shot him. Why did you shoot him?" The gunman replied that Michael had frightened him by turning too quickly. After ignoring her pleas to shoot her as well, or let her get help for Michael, the gunman told her to kiss him. She refused, and having managed to free her hands, managed to disarm him, but was overpowered. After he threatened to shoot her, she relented. He then retrieved a cloth from the duffel bag, and he covered Michael's head. Didn't want to look at him, I guess. And ordered Valerie to climb into the back of the car over Michael's body. When she refused, the man got out and forced her out of the car at gunpoint, pushing her onto the back seat, where he ordered her to undo her bra and remove her knickers before raping her. Oh my goodness. He then ordered Valerie to drag Michael's body out of the car onto the edge of the lay-by 2 or 3 meters away. He done that after he raped her. Before ordering her back into the car to start it for him and demonstrate the operation of the gears and switches. He was done for all these car thefts and he can't actually drive a car. It was clear he had either not driven before or was unfamiliar with a Morris Minor. Valerie then left the car and returned to sit beside Michael's body. The gunman got out of the car and approached her, pleading for her life. She took a £1 note from her pocket, screaming, "Here, take this, take the car and go." He took several steps back to the car before turning and firing 4 bullets at her, then reloaded and fired again. Of approximately 7 bullets fired, 5 hit Valerie. She fell to the ground next to Michael and played dead. Satisfied he had killed her, the gunman drove off southward with much crashing of gears in the direction of Luton. It was now approximately 3 a.m, 6 hours after the ordeal had started at Dorney Reach. After vainly screaming and waving her petticoat to attract the attention of passing motorists, Valerie lost consciousness. The first policeman on the scene was handed a census form on which John, the witness guy who flagged help, had written down Valerie's gasped account of what she recalled at that moment. The document was never seen again. Valerie gave another statement to police later that morning, just before she underwent surgery in Bedford Hospital. Valerie recalled what the man had said about being on the run for 4 months, yet he was immaculately dressed in a dark 3-piece suit and with well-shined shoes. In the evening of Thursday the 21st of August, the murder weapon, a .38 revolver, was discovered under the back seat of a 36A London bus, fully loaded and wiped clean of fingerprints. With the gun was a handkerchief which provided DNA evidence many years later. The police issued an appeal to boarding house keepers to report any unusual or suspicious guests. The manager of the Alexandra Court Hotel reported a man who had locked himself in his room for 5 days after the murder, and the police picked him up. The suspect falsely identified himself as Frederick Durrant. He was actually Peter Lewis Alphon, a drifter surviving on an inheritance and the proceeds of gambling. Peter was the son of a senior figure at Scotland Yard. Peter claimed he had spent the evening of the 22nd of August with his mother and the following night at the Vienna Hotel in Maida Vale. The police quickly confirmed this and Peter was released. On the 29th of August, Valerie and another witness, Edward Blackhall, who had seen the driver of the Morris Minor, compiled an identikit picture which was then released. However, only 2 days later, Valerie gave a different description of her assailant to the police. On the 7th of September, I can't pronounce the name, but another lady was attacked in her home in Richmond by a man claiming to be the A6 murderer, whom she later identified as Peter in an identity parade on the 23rd of September. On the 11th of September, 2 cartridge cases were found in the guest basement bedroom of the Vienna Hotel, which were matched to the bullets that killed Michael and to the ones in the gun found on the bus. The hotel manager, William, made a statement to police naming the last occupant of the room as James Ryan. At the trial, William, the hotel owner, also stated the man, upon leaving, had asked the way to the bus stop for a 36A bus, though his statement to police had merely mentioned the 36 bus. William's statement also said that Peter had stayed in the hotel as he claimed and had remained in his room 6, all night. The police raided the hotel and questioned William again, who then changed his story, claiming that Peter had in fact been in the basement and Ryan in room 6, but for reasons unknown had swapped rooms during the night. William also now added that Peter had left the hotel calm and composed. I don't think William knows what's going on and is just interfering, basically. The police then took the unusual step of publicly naming Peter Alphon as the murder suspect. Peter subsequently surrendered himself and was subjected to an intense interrogation. Valerie did not recognise Peter in an identity parade, and he was released 4 days later after being detained on a charge of assaulting the poor lady whose name I can't pronounce. Peter was recorded by PC Ian Thompson as saying, quote, "There can't have been any fingerprints in the car, otherwise mine would have given me away." Police went back to William, the hotel manager, who himself had a lengthy criminal record for fraud and other offences. I knew there was something shady about him. Who now said that his second statement was a lie and that his first statement, implicating Ryan, the fake name, was in fact true. His reason for lying was that he had seen that Peter was the police's prime suspect and had wanted to assist their case. So he's trying to help, but lying, that does not help at all. After some investigation, Ryan turned out to be James Hanratty, a 25-year-old petty criminal with 4 convictions for car theft, larceny and burglary. James telephoned Scotland Yard several times saying he fled because he had no credible alibi for the date in question, but repeated each time that he had nothing to do with the A6 murder. During one of the phone calls, he pronounced think as think. On the 11th of October, James was arrested by police in Blackpool. I lived there. At the Stavonia Cafe. Yeah, that's a shady place. It's changed names now. On the 14th of October, Valerie identified James in an identity parade. After each of the men in the parade had to repeat the phrase used by the murderer, "Be quiet, will you? I'm thinking." James was then charged with the capital murder of Michael Gregstein. The trial. James's capital murder trial started at Bedfordshire on the 22nd of January 1962. It was originally to have been heard at the Old Bailey as requested by James's defence counsel. It is not known why the trial was moved to Bedford, just 9 miles from the murder scene, although this afforded easier access for the now paraplegic Valerie, who had received treatment at nearby Stoke Mandeville Hospital. Among the prosecution team at the trial was Geoffrey Lane, who was subsequently appointed Lord Chief Justice. The trial lasted 21 days, the longest in English legal history up to that time. James' initial defence was that he had been in Liverpool on the day of the murder, but then halfway through the trial he changed part of his story, claiming that he had been in fact in Rhyl in North Wales. At that time there was no conclusive forensic evidence to connect James with the car or the murder scene, although James's blood group O was the same as the murderer's. It was a fairly common blood type shared by 36% of the British population, including Peter Alphon. And apart from Valerie's identification, there was no other evidence that James had ever been in the Maidenhead area. Whilst he was a professional thief, he had no convictions for violence and apparently never possessed a gun, although he later admitted to the police that he had attempted to obtain one after his release from prison in March 1961. Moreover, the murderer drove badly, whereas James was an experienced car thief. No defence on the basis of mental history was raised at his trial. Was he an experienced car thief? Because every time he nicked a car, he got caught, we assume, because he couldn't drive. The first defence. James claimed that he was staying with friends in Liverpool at the time of the murder, where he had also gone to see one of his criminal friends and former cellmate, Terry McNally, from Dingle, to sell some jewellery. James claimed that his suitcase had been handed into Lime Street Station by a, quote, man with a withered or turned hand. At the trial, the prosecution called Peter Stringer, who had an artificial arm, but who denied ever having seen the suitcase or James. However, there was another person called William Usher, who did have 2 fingers missing from one hand, which looked withered. William Usher admitted remembering James and the suitcase, and partly remembered the name of the man as Ratty. He was located by private detectives working for the defence, but was never called as a witness. James said that he had called into a sweet shop in Scotland Road and asked directions to Carlton or Tarleton Road. The police tracked down a Mrs. Dinwoodie, who served in a sweet shop in Scotland Road, and who recalled a man like James asking for directions. However, she was certain that this occurred on Monday the 21st of August. There was plenty of evidence that James had been in London all day on Monday the 21st of August. In the morning, he had deposited a suit into a dry cleaner's in Swiss Cottage. He had been to his friend Charles France's house on Monday afternoon and visited the Vienna Hotel in the evening. James's defence claimed that Mrs. Dinwoodie was mistaken about the date. So they're trying to build a defence and then they're like, wow, not helpful, must have been mistaken. Just before the defence opened its case, James changed part of his alibi. It's not funny, but James confessed to his defence barrister that he had invented the part of the Liverpool story, as he was unsure he could prove where he was. So you can't prove where you are, so you're lying about where you were, because that'll prove it. Then he stated that he had in fact been in the Welsh coastal town of Rhyl. Within a few days, the defence had checked and assembled a new alibi for James. According to this, James had gone to Rhyl to sell a stolen watch. Arriving there in the evening of Tuesday the 22nd of August and staying in a boarding house near the railway line, private detectives tracked down a Mrs. Grace Jones, a landlady with a guest house which had a green bath in the attic, as described by James. She remembered a man resembling James and at first said he stayed there during the week of the 19th to the 22nd of August, but later said she couldn't really remember what week he did stay. The prosecution produced witnesses attesting that all the rooms were already occupied at the time and accused Mrs. Jones of being an unreliable witness. Eventually, the jury retired. After 6 hours, they returned to ask the judge for the definition of reasonable doubt. After 9 hours, they returned to the court and entered a unanimous verdict. Guilty. James's appeal was dismissed on the 13th of March, and despite a petition signed by more than 90,000 people, James was hanged by executioner Harry Allen at Bedford on the 4th of April 1962, still protesting his innocence. James was initially buried in the grounds of Bedford, but on the 22nd of February 1966, his remains were exhumed and reinterred in a grave at Watford, later shared with his aunt. The A6 Defence Committee was a self-appointed group of campaigners and activists who included the journalist Paul Foot and the Labour politicians Fenner Brockway and Joan Lester. The former and current MPs for the Eton and Slough constituency where Valerie lived. The committee was part funded by John Lennon and Yoko Ono, who met publicly with James's family. The committee attempted to assist James in his defence and later tried to disprove his conviction. The A6 committee made a list of claims which, they contended, indicated that Peter Alphon was the murderer. Peter resembled the identikit pictures more than James did. When stressed, Peter Alphon lapsed into Cockney. Peter never produced a convincing alibi. Well, neither did James. He provided a more credible motive than James could. He was a poor driver, as witnesses had seen the Morris Minor being driven erratically towards Redbridge Station. Paul Foote obtained a copy of his bank account showing that Peter received payments in cash totalling £7,569 between October 1961 and June 1962. Paul Foote warned, quote, against jumping to hasty conclusions, in particular about Peter Alphon. He really didn't know as much as he pretended. He certainly didn't know what he alleged, that Mrs. Gregstein was the prime mover in the commissioning of the murder. A journalist and campaigner, Ludovic, wrote many articles ascertaining James's innocence. However, in a new edition of his book, 36 Murders and 2 Immoral Earnings, printed immediately after the publication of the DNA evidence, he retracted entirely this Hanratty story. We haven't even heard about that yet. It's too early, isn't it, for DNA? I think it was in the 80s, early 90s-ish. Justice and Fox. During 1962, the case caught the interest of London businessman Jean Justice, the son of a Belgian diplomat and partner of barrister Jeremy Fox. Jean encouraged the initially reluctant Jeremy to help him expose what he believed to be the fabrication of the case against James Hanratty. The pair tracked down Peter Alphon in February 1962 and began a long friendship with him for the purposes of establishing the truth. Jean Justice attended the trial every day, being driven there by his chauffeur, and Alphon accompanied him from time to time. Jean took the precaution of making thorough notes and recording all telephone conversations with Peter Alphon. When Peter found out, he flew into a rage. He started to bombard his own solicitor with threatening phone calls and letters. Charles France was also the recipient of a highly unpleasant anonymous phone call. Charles, who had suffered from bouts of severe depression for many years, committed suicide by gassing himself, his third attempt. About 2 weeks before the execution, he wrote a suicide letter to James. It was full of spite and venom, but at no point actually accused him of committing the murder. He also wrote a letter to the coroner in which he referred to the great harm done to the family by James. Charles also left behind several letters for his family, the contents of which have never been made public. At the time of Charles's second suicide attempt in January, one of the letters he left was addressed to the coroner, in which he wrote, quote, I am of sound mind and body. I do this act in the knowledge that it will clear my family's character of any act or wrong. The circumstances of James's introduction to France's family and the reasons for the crippling sense of guilt harboured by him for the harm he felt James had inflicted on them, so great that it could only be cured, if you like, by suicide, remain a mystery. According to Peter Alphon, a man had paid him a sum of £5,000 to end the affair between Michael and Valerie. Another man obtained a gun for Peter, whereupon he set off and hijacked the pair. Peter claimed he gave Michael 2 chances to get away, but, quote, each time the bloody man kept coming back. He also claimed the gun went off by accident. A BBC Panorama programme in 1966 included extracts from the Gene Justice tapes. Peter Alphon stuck to his confession and continued to repeat it until about 1971, when he withdrew his claims. However, Bob Woofenden wrote that there was only one occasion when Justice and Jeremy Fox supported Peter Alphon financially, when Fox paid for a hotel bill for him. Fox split from Gene Justice in the 1970s, but continued to fight to clear James Hanratty until his death in 1999. Peter Alphon died in January 2009 after a fall at his home. The following month, Richard Ingrams, a close friend and colleague of Paul Foot, wrote a brief article about his part in the case. Richard said that Peter Alphon, in conversations with Paul Foot and others, had spoken obsessively about the case, frequently incriminating himself. He said that Paul Foot continued until his own death in 2004 to believe in James Hanratty's alibi. This is strange. This Peter person has now just admitted that he's been paid to end the affair. This is all very weird. I thought this was clear cut. Official inquiries. The Hanratty family, acting through their solicitor, repeatedly called for further inquiries into the case. Bob Woofenden wrote that there is no evidence that the witnesses even saw the same Morris Minor. The case for Hanratty's innocence was pursued by his family as well as by some of the opponents of the capital punishment in the United Kingdom, who maintained that James was innocent and sought to draw attention to the evidence that would cast doubt on the validity of his conviction. The 3 Home Office inquiries were set up. 1. On the 22nd of March 1967, Detective Superintendent Douglas Nemo reported to Home Secretary Roy Jenkins. On the 10th of April 1975, Lewis Horser, QC, reported to Home Secretary Roy Jenkins. On the 29th of May 1996, Detective Chief Superintendent Roger Matthews reported to Home Secretary Michael Howard. During the 1990s, increasingly advanced DNA analysis techniques became widely available. Here we go, now we'll get the answers. On the 19th of March 1997, the Home Office referred the case to the new Criminal Case Review Commission, where Baden Skit chaired the investigation. While some of the original items of physical evidence were destroyed, the sample from Valerie's underwear had been discovered in 1991, and in late 1997, the handkerchief that subsequently found in the possession of the Berkshire Police. DNA was donated by James Hanratty's mother and brother, which they expected to exonerate him when compared with the DNA extracted from the surviving evidence. Results from testing in June 1999 were said to be strong evidence of a familial match. The evidential DNA was, quote, 2.5 million times more likely to belong to James Hanratty than to anyone else. The Court of Appeal did not have the power to order an exhumation of James Hanratty's body, but Lord Chief Justice Wolfe decided that this was desirable in the interests of justice. James Hanratty's body was exhumed in 2001 to extract his DNA. His DNA was compared with the other DNA extracted from, firstly, mucus preserved in the handkerchief within which the murder weapon had been found wrapped in, and secondly, semen preserved in the underwear worn by Valerie when she was raped. DNA samples from both sources matched exactly to James Hanratty's DNA. No DNA other than Hanratty's was found on the handkerchief in which the murder weapon had been found wrapped. The other piece of evidence tested, a sample from Valerie's underwear, provided two different sets of male DNA, one that corresponded to James and one which the Court of Appeal interpreted as coming from Michael. The decision by the Court of Appeal included a discussion of handling the various items of evidence involved. The argument contamination was dismissed as fanciful by the judges, who concluded that the DNA evidence standing alone is certain proof of guilt. Modern testing of DNA from James's exhumed corpse and members of his family convinced the Court of Appeal judges in 2002 that James Hanratty's guilt was proved beyond doubt. However, they further went on to note in the summary of their judgment, the DNA evidence does not stand alone, and the court refers to some more striking coincidences in the light of the DNA evidence. If James Hanratty was not guilty, he would have been wrongly identified by 3 witnesses at an identification parade, first as the person at the scene of the crime and second by 2 witnesses driving a vehicle close to where the vehicle in which the murder was committed was found. He had the same identifying manner of speech as the killer. He stayed in a room the night before the crime from which the bullets that had been fired from the murder weapon were recovered. The murder weapon was recovered from a place on a bus which regarded as a hiding place, and the bus followed a route he could well have used. His DNA was found on a piece of material from Valerie Story's knickers, where it would be expected to be if he was guilty. It was also found on the handkerchief found with the gun. The court concludes that this number of alleged coincidences mean that they are not coincidences, but provide overwhelming proof of the safety of the conviction from an evidential perspective. Paul Foot and some of the other campaigners argued elsewhere that the DNA evidence could have been contaminated in view of the fact that the small DNA samples from items of clothing kept in a police lab for over 40 years in conditions that they argue, quote, did not satisfy modern evidential standards, had to be subjected to amplification techniques to yield any genetic profile. Legacy. James Hanratty's family and their supporters have continued to contest this conclusion and to press for a further review of his conviction. Valerie was quoted as saying, quote, I identified the guilty man. I looked in his eyes and he looked in mine. I knew who he was and he knew that I recognised him. I had found the guilty person. Following the DNA evidence in 2002, Valerie earned over £40,000 for her participation in various TV and newspaper documentaries. All of this money was anonymously donated to Slough Mobility Transport for the purchase of 2 new vehicles, one of which named Valerie. Valerie died on the 26th of March in 2016, aged 77, in the Chippenham house where she had been born. They got him. It was him all along. I don't know what Peter Alphon was playing at, trying to throw us off the scent there. Thank you so much for joining me. Give me your thoughts on this case. I would love to read them down below. More and more of you are coming across my true crime episodes and are leaving me comments. I'm loving it. So, thank you so much for joining me. And I shall see you next Thursday for another episode in our true crime. Love, hugs and sparkles to you all. Bye.